All right, if you're gearing up for the AP World History exam, you already know the single biggest challenge, connecting 800 years of history. Well, guess what? That's exactly what we're about to do. This is your high-speed, big-picture review of the entire modern course, from 1200 all the way to today. We're going to lock in the key patterns you absolutely need for exam day. So let's just dive right in.
So this is the question, isn't it? It's what every AP World student is thinking. How in the world do you take all these centuries of empires, revolutions, and massive global changes and turn them into one coherent story for your essays? I know, it sounds super daunting, but the secret isn't about memorizing every little detail. It's about mastering the major patterns of change over time.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the course blueprint itself. Then we'll march chronologically through the 4 big eras. We've got the fragmented world, then the first global age, the age of revolutions, and finally our modern century of crisis. And we'll wrap it all up by tying everything together with the biggest themes you're going to need for those essays. Let's get started. First things first, let's break down the blueprint of the course. You should really think of this as your secret weapon. See, the exam isn't designed to trip you up with a bunch of random, obscure facts. Nope. It's built around a really clear story of historical change. And if you understand that structure, you're already one step closer to a great score. The whole course, which runs from around 1200 to today, is chopped up into 9 units. But here's the thing. The number one skill the exam is testing is your ability to trace historical patterns across those units. Being able to explain continuity and change over time, that's how you build the killer arguments that earn top marks on your DBQs and LAQs. So let's jump into our first era. Before about 1450, the world wasn't really a single interconnected system like we think of it today. It was more like a patchwork quilt, a bunch of really powerful, impressive, but mostly separate civilizations, each kind of doing its own thing. And this is the really simple but brilliant logic of the first 2 units. Unit 1 is all about introducing the major players of the era. You've got the super innovative Song dynasty in China, the huge and culturally connected Islamic world, the Aztec Empire, and then bam! Unit 2 shows you how all these powerful regions started to connect through growing trade networks, like the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean routes. So what was the spark for that huge explosion in connectivity? Well, it was the Mongols. By conquering this absolutely massive piece of Eurasia, they created something called the Pax Mongolica, basically a period of peace that made trade way safer and way more extensive than it had ever been. And this just hit the fast-forward button on the spread of everything, from gunpowder to, unfortunately, the plague. And that brings us to the next great transformation, a period where new technologies and powerful empires start to weave the world into a single, global network for the very first time. This is a game changer. You can see the dominoes fall right here. On land, you've got these huge gunpowder empires, think the Ottomans, the Mughals, using new weapons to centralize their power. At the exact same time, new maritime tech like the caravel ship lets Europeans explore the open oceans, which leads them to the Americas and, boom, the creation of the first truly global connections. Now, the single most important result of this whole era is the Columbian Exchange. And listen, this was not just about trade. This was a fundamental rewiring of the entire planet's biology. You've got New World crops like potatoes and corn totally changing diets around the world, while Old World diseases just devastated indigenous American populations. This, in turn, created a massive labor demand that fueled the horrific transatlantic slave trade. Okay, let's dive into the next era and hold on tight, because this period is one of absolutely radical, world-shaking change. We're talking new ideas about government, new ways of making stuff, and new kinds of empires that completely reshaped the globe. This timeline shows a perfect cause and effect cascade. It all starts with the Enlightenment, where philosophers are cooking up these radical new ideas about liberty and who should have power. Then those ideas catch fire and ignite political revolutions in America, France, Haiti. At the same time, a totally different kind of revolution, the Industrial Revolution, is transforming economies and creating this insatiable hunger for raw materials and new markets. And what was the major consequence of that industrial hunger? A new, way more aggressive wave of imperialism. Industrialized nations in Europe, but also the US and Japan, use their new technological power to dominate huge parts of Africa and Asia, creating these global economic inequalities that, honestly, we're still dealing with today. And that brings us to the modern era, the 20th century. This period is really defined by its extremes.
I mean, it saw the most destructive wars in all of human history, right alongside the creation of the deeply interconnected global society we live in now.
You can really think of these last 3 units as one continuous story. It kicks off in Unit 7, where 2 world wars just shatter the old land-based and colonial empires. Then, Unit 8 explores what rises from the ashes, the big Cold War struggle between the US and the USSR, and decolonization, where all these former colonies gain their independence. And that all leads to Unit 9, which looks at our world after the Cold War, a world defined by this super-fast acceleration of globalization, driven by tech like the internet.
All right, everyone, lean in, because this is probably the most important part of our entire review. If you really want to nail your essays, you have to be able to talk about these 5 major patterns that run through the whole course. These are the threads that tie everything we just talked about together.
First up is the ever-increasing pace of connection. It's a story that starts with the humble Silk Roads, hits the accelerator with the Columbian Exchange, and then just explodes with industrial-era steamships and telegraphs, leading right up to the internet-driven world we live in today.
Second, you've got the classic cycle of empires. We watch the land-based gunpowder empires use new tech to centralize their power. Then they get overshadowed by sea-based European empires that can project their power across entire oceans. And finally, in the 20th century, a combination of nationalism and the insane costs of war leads to the collapse of pretty much all of these colonial systems. You just can't talk about modern history without talking about the Industrial Revolution. And remember, this was so much more than just factories. It created brand new social classes, new economic systems like capitalism and socialism, and as we saw, it was the main engine behind modern imperialism. Number 4, the huge conflicts that really defined the modern world. We're talking about the 2 world wars, which totally reshapes the global balance of power. And of course, the Cold War, that 50-year ideological battle between communism and capitalism that left its mark on just about every corner of the globe. And finally, we have the twin forces of the late 20th century. On one hand, you have decolonization, which saw the birth of dozens of new nations across Africa and Asia. On the other, you have globalization, creating new international groups like the UN and this deeply interconnected economic and cultural system. Okay, look at this table. This is your ultimate cheat sheet for building historical arguments. Seriously, for any essay, you have to show cause and effect. Use these connections. For instance, you could argue that the immediate need for raw materials from the Industrial Revolution was a direct cause of the long-term consequence of a new aggressive imperialism. Mastering these kinds of links is the absolute key to a high-scoring essay. And that's really the whole point of this course, isn't it? By understanding these long-term patterns of connection, of conflict, and of change, you're not just memorizing stuff about the past, you're actually getting the tools to understand the world you're living in right now. So, I'll just leave you with this question. We've seen how technology drives connection, how empires rise and fall, how ideological struggles can define a whole century. As you look at the world today, which of these patterns do you see playing out all over again? Is it the competition between great powers, the impact of new tech like AI, or the ongoing struggle for political and economic freedom? That's the real value of history. Good luck on your exam. You've got this.